Hey guys, so the last video that we made about COVID was talking about how extreme it had become, about how if the kids had cold symptoms that they had to stay home, and that if someone had a temperature over 37 degrees that we all had to stay home, and how it had got more crazy, and how Japan had the highest number of new infections of any country in the world and the second highest rate of deaths anywhere in the world. And so that was only a few weeks ago, that video, and it got all extreme, and everybody was and we were stuck at home. We were stuck at home for a week, and then because one of the kids had a temperature of 37, so we had to stay home until we all got cleared and make sure we didn't have COVID. And then one of the other kids got a temperature of 37 because it's winter, and because in winter people catch colds and kids get fevers. So that's what was happening. Nobody had COVID. It was just they had colds, but that was what was happening last time I made the video and talked about that, and about how extreme it had become here with the huge number of cases and everything else. So, interestingly, the government's now talking about downgrading COVID from being a class 2 disease, which is the second highest apparently, to a class 5 disease, which is the same as influenza. So, which is great. I mean, this is good, right? But it's just amazing, isn't it? This roller coaster that it is of how the Japanese government deals with COVID. So they're talking about, we heard spring and we heard April. So they're talking about spring or April, somewhere around there, downgrading COVID from a class 2 to a class 5. So what that's going to mean, is, the good thing about that is that craziness where if someone in the family has a fever that you all got to stay home, that should disappear. And because the way they treat influenza here is if someone gets influenza, they should stay home. Well, that's okay, and the other family members should be able to go out. And it's sort of vaguely worded because they haven't quite worked it out yet, but that's what it should mean, that if someone in the family's got COVID, that they should have to stay home. And the other people should be able to go out. And then it talked about vaguely about the people who actually have COVID, how much their movement is restricted. So I don't know what that means. They're not clear about that yet. So we're still going to wait and see what all this means. But the good thing about it is it should give us more freedom, because the amount of work that we've missed over the last 3 years has been ridiculous. So if they lift that, that'll be fantastic. The other thing that they're talking about too is lifting the guidelines. So some of you remember there's no actual laws about what we can and can't do as far as COVID's concerned. It's all guidelines, and they ask us to do and not do things. So they're talking about changing the guidelines about wearing masks inside, which would be fabulous as well. Because at the moment it's pretty ridiculous. You walk into a restaurant, you have to wear a mask to walk into the restaurant, but then you take it off as soon as you sit down anyway, so it makes it sort of pointless. So that we're talking about lifting that. However, I mean, the freedom of not having to stay home if someone else is sick is the best thing that comes from all that. But when it comes to this mask stuff and all the rest of it, can't see it changing, because as some of you know, before COVID actually happened, Japanese people have always been, for the last 80 years, have been really germophobic and really paranoid about germs and things. We've talked about this lots of times before. And the mask thing was a huge thing here. The first video we made about masks in Japan was about 10 years ago. So wearing masks here and hiding from germs and stuff has been a huge thing here forever. And then along comes COVID. So we've had 3 years of all the authorities stoking the fear and paranoia and stuff about COVID, which has really ramped up the germophobia here to a whole new level, right? So it's not likely that if the government suddenly goes, after 3 years of saying, look out for COVID, it's going to kill you and all the rest of it. Just touch on this briefly too. They recently did a study and found that the number of people who have died in Japan, who are dying from Japan from COVID, is the same percentage that were dying in Japan from influenza. So that's the other reason that they're going to put it on the same level as influenza, right? Which after 3 years of telling them how bad and how scary and how be careful and COVID, just you cannot stop from hearing about it still now. I mean, even though they're talking about 3 or 4 months from now changing it, they're still going on with all the paranoia stuff now, right? Which is just, they're feeding that, which means the average Japanese person and the average Japanese business owner and restaurant owner and hotel owner and all these other people, they're not going to suddenly change. If the government suddenly goes, oh, now it's a category 5, not a category 2, I can't see that's going to change at all. You know, I can't see that. I can't see the signs outside the shops and the cafes and the restaurants and the hotels that say you have to wear a mask, you have to wash your hands with alcohol. I can't see that suddenly changing overnight. You know, it's pretty likely that it's just going to stay and that everybody's going to keep wearing their masks. And some of you would have seen the video I made a while ago, loving the mask in Japan. I mean, there's a high percentage of Japanese people just love the mask. They loved the mask before COVID, and they'll love the mask even more now, and they just don't want to take it off. And, you know, those of you who haven't seen that video, watch that, because there's people here, a lot of people here who wear masks when they don't have to anyway. So if suddenly the government says you don't have to wear a mask anymore, they still will. So I just can't see that affecting anything, you know. It's just because the government suddenly goes, oh, it's all right now. For 3 years we've been telling you that it's the end of the world, but no, it's all right now. Just before I forget too, some of you might remember the first video I made about COVID 3 years ago, the first video talking about it. I'd actually got on the internet, I've been searching through and trying to get information on it, and I found an article by a guy from a university, maybe in Hong Kong, and he was a COVID specialist. So before COVID-19, you know, he'd been studying the other COVID outbreaks that had happened over the years, and he was a COVID specialist before COVID-19 came along, right? And he said, you know, it's really not much different from influenza. And, you know, and he said a few things like that, right? And in my very first video about COVID in Japan, I quoted him and said, this is what this guy said. And people lost their minds, right? People absolutely lost their minds. All the comments, you know, these people going, oh, it's, you know, people are going to die, you know, it's not the same as influenza. And unfortunately, too, I think Trump said something similar at the time. And that really fucked it up then, because if Trump said it, you know, it had to be insane. And so a whole heap of people got really emotional about that. So here we are 3 years later, and the statistics show that the amount of deaths due to influenza are the same as due to COVID are the same as influenza, and the Japanese government's about to downgrade it to the same level as influenza, which means that they're saying it's the same as influenza. It seems. I don't know. It doesn't. My observations over the last 3 years is some people got severely affected by COVID, and it really messed them up permanently, either killed them or permanent breathing damage and all sorts of stuff. And I know people, you know, I know there's a guy I do martial arts with who had it a year or so ago and says his breathing still isn't normal. So no doubt, you know, and that guy probably had influenza before and wasn't affected by that. So who knows? But, you know, my own observations aside, this is what the Japanese government's decided. So as far as people coming and going, no talk yet. They usually don't think about the foreigners or the tourists until later in these processes, but there's been no talk about, they still have the requirement when you come to Japan that you have to have done a COVID test 72 hours before you come to Japan, and you have to have a certificate to show that you're negative, and that has to be taken within 72 hours before you come to Japan. So that's not likely to change. There was a bit of a drama here recently because they've really lightened up. At the same time they've been telling everybody to be paranoid, they've basically there's been no restriction on movement generally, unless someone in your family's sick, and for tourists coming and going and everything, they realised their economy was dying. So they've just basically gone, right, everybody help yourself, you know, do whatever you want. Except for China. Recently there's a bit of a drama here. Because China had some outbreaks, they suddenly banned direct flights from some cities in China to Japan, which really pissed the Chinese government off. And it was a bit irrational, really, because, I mean, Japan was already having the highest number of new cases in the world. So, you know, it'd be more logical for China to ban flights from Japan. But anyway, they banned flights from some cities in China, but only those cities in China and not any other country in the world. So that really upset the Chinese government. So then the Chinese government suspended Japanese and South Korean tourists, suspended visas for Japanese and South Korean tourists. So basically said that Japanese people and South Korean people could not visit China for the time being. So which is sort of cutting their own throats really, because they need the tourism. But that's how pissed off they were at that snubbing, you know. But yeah, with the exception of those people who were going to get flights from China to Japan, the rest of the people around the world who are coming to visit Japan, it shouldn't affect you at all. So yeah, the reality of what this means. I'm just checking to see if there's anything else. Yeah, the reality of what this means to us, you know. So if these changes happen, which they probably will, usually they start talking about any changes months before they actually make them. So when those changes happen in April or whenever it happens, how it's actually going to practically affect us is probably not going to be much. The bit we're looking forward to is that if they say that, then the schools and everybody else and our work and everything else should lighten up. Unless we have COVID ourselves, we should be able to still go about our business, which means a lot to us because we've missed a lot of work because of this nonsense. But other than that, probably won't see much difference. You know, if you live in Japan already or you're coming to visit, probably the mask thing and the alcohol thing is probably not going to go away for years, because we had it before. You know, we made videos about the masks and the alcohol years ago. The first one we made about masks was about 10 years ago, and we made one about the same time about the alcohol. They've always had, you know, places you'd go where there'd be bottles of alcohol for you to wash your hands, and people wore masks because of all sorts of reasons, social reasons. And you know, I should dig that old video out because that was about 10 years ago. It would sort of be a bit nostalgic now, but so it's not going to change. And because of the COVID thing, there's a whole heap of people their germophobia has been taken to a whole new level now. So it's not likely that the masks and the alcohol are going to go away. We're probably stuck with that for years and years. Doesn't matter who says what, you know. Again, just a reminder, those of you who might have heard me mention before that Tokyo University did a study years ago and found that the reason that Japanese people have such a high rate of hay fever and allergies and are so susceptible to getting sick is because they've lived in a sterile environment since they were babies, and that as a result of that, their immunity system is weak. So that was Tokyo University. Oh, someone got pissed off because I said Tokyo University. It's the University of Tokyo. Do people get pissed off about funny things? You don't know what you're talking about. You called it Tokyo University. It's the University of Tokyo said that's why Japanese people get sick so much, is because their immunity systems are weak, because they hide from germs from when they're babies, you know. And we saw that study released, and it got talked about on TV. We saw it talked about on TV once and never heard it mentioned again. They've never mentioned it again. And through all this COVID thing and everything else, never heard that mentioned again. So those guys must be frustrated. They took all the time to do their studies and came up with this conclusion, and Japan ignored them because it goes against the status quo, right? You know, anything that goes against the status quo where people want to say, maybe we're not doing it right, Japanese people don't want to hear that, because the system must be perfect and we must accept everything the way it is, and that there's no need to change anything because it's all perfect. So if those guys come along and say, look, we think that we're spending too much time with the alcohol and the masks and hiding from germs, and it's not good for us and it's making us weaker, they don't want to hear that. They don't want to hear that. So get used to the masks and the alcohol. That's not going to change. But we might not be stuck at home as much as we have been, which is a really good thing, because that doesn't help pay the bills at all. So anyway, that's enough of that. A little bit cold. It hasn't actually been, this winter has not been as cold as previous winters. So not yet. It might get colder, but so far it's not that cold. But I'm sitting out in the middle of the rice field in winter, so it's chilly. Anyway, that's enough of that. More videos coming soon.